Thank you for joining us for today's Ipsos Inside Track webinar briefing featuring data and trends that will impact the 2024 elections. Today's webinar is being presented by experts from Ipsos's public political polling team. Throughout today's session, you will remain in listen-only mode. However, throughout the webinar, please submit your questions online using the Q&A feature. Our plan is to answer questions at the end of today's session. However, if time does run short, your question will be answered by email. Today's session is also being recorded and will be directly emailed to you. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our May Inside Track webinar. It's great to be with you today. I am joined, as always, by our data journalist, Bernard Mendez, and our editorial director, Sarah Feldman. They will be helping me share this data with you today. And we do have a lot of data to get through, so I will jump right in. The agenda may look like a lot, but really what we're doing today is much more of a deep dive into a single poll rather than sort of covering off a lot of the research that we've done over the last month. However, Ipsos has done a lot of public opinion polling over the last month, and I encourage you to go to our website, ipsos.com, and check out what we have going on. We have had lots of interesting data we've been pushing out into the public. But today we're going to focus on a couple of key points, particularly as it comes to the election, which is increasingly coming into focus. But first off, I'm going to, as always, do some level setting and talk about the main issues facing the American public, what America is worried about, because as always, that is the thing that fundamentally sets the terms of the debate. So what do we see from our Ipsos core political data from May, just a little over a week ago? What we're seeing is the economy, unemployment, and jobs has actually increased in importance. It's up a little bit higher than it was before and is basically tied with political extremism and threats to democracy as the #1 issue facing the country, while immigration has sort of fallen off a little bit as a top issue. Now, you may remember last month when we did this, those three issues were basically tied in that first position. We're now seeing much more of a clear sort of two-way first place with then a second tier immigration issue and then everything else sort of further down the lists. So what do we see over time? Well, political extremism and threats to democracy have been about at the same level, a little over 20% of the American public saying that that's their #1 concern. But we've seen an increase in the economy, unemployment, and jobs is the main issue, and a essentially equivalent decrease in immigration falling off. So what's happening? Well, it's not that the economy is all of a sudden a lot worse. What we're seeing actually, I think, this is my theory, is that media attention of immigration has really fallen off over the last month and a half to 2 months. And immigration, we know, is something that whenever it hits high levels, it's because of that media attention. It's because particularly conservative media is calling a lot of attention to the issue. So what we're seeing is that Republicans, particularly who in April were saying immigration was one of their #1 issues, aren't saying that as much and instead are looking at the economy, focusing on the economy, and that's driving that shift we're seeing, whereas Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents continue to sort of focus more on political extremism and threats to democracy as their #1 issue. So it's not necessarily that all of a sudden the economy is changing, the economy is driving greater levels of interest. It's actually that immigration is falling off the agenda a little bit as media reporting on it sort of has dried up over the last month and a half or so, leading to sort of that change in sort of the relative position. But with that, the economy and inflation, rising prices, when we ask people directly what the main issue affecting their vote, not just the main issue overall, continues to be sort of a clear dominant concern, with 88% of Americans saying the economy, 85% saying inflation will be important to their vote. We see crime, healthcare, protecting American democracy sort of as in the second tier. Immigration here too sort of falling off a little bit lower down the list. Gun violence, America's standing in the world, abortion, the conflict in Israel, all sort of down the list. So the economy and inflation we still view as the deciding issue for this election. There's actually a couple of things that we've talked about in the past about how among that swing electorate, that group of people whom we actually have some new views on, we'll talk about, Sarah and Bernard will talk about in a moment, are the groups that are going to decide the election. And with that, I want to hand over to Sarah to talk about some of our latest economic data to help set up the ongoing discussion of what we're seeing in the election. Sarah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Chris. Great. Yeah, so this is a familiar slide for folks who have tuned into the Inside Track webinar before. It's our consumer confidence tracker that goes all the way back to 2002, where we've been tracking how people feel about the economy and their place in it. And what's really distinct about this moment we're in, and is kind of a nuance about public opinion in the economy right now, is that the macroeconomic environment has been fairly robust. Inflation has come down, unemployment remains relatively low, but consumers have had this lukewarm relationship to those trends, to those macroeconomic changes and updates. People are still feeling a little uneasy. We do see consumer confidence inch up as inflation has eased, but it is not where we might expect it given the overall, given where inflation and unemployment are right now. And I think you can really see why in this next slide. Here we're diving a little bit deeper into our consumer confidence trend and some of the underlying questions that make up that index. And purchasing power, how confident people feel in their ability to make major household purchases or just everyday purchases, are really a proxy for inflation. And as we can see in this chart, purchasing confidence has been slower to rebound. People are still not feeling quite as confident as they were before the pandemic or during that kind of elated peak in the spring of 2021 when vaccines were being rolled out and there was stimulus money in the economy. We're really not seeing a rebound to those levels. So certainly we're seeing lingering impacts of inflation overriding and really framing consumers' relationship to the economy right now. And like Chris said, that influences who and what people care about as it relates to this election and what their main worries are and what they might do about that come November. So really important space to be keeping in mind and paying attention to, and something we'll certainly be tracking over the next few months. Now, moving on to another big newsy item, the Trump trials. We are expecting some developments on the hush money New York State case that is before the court right now. Arguments are closing. There is a lot of fluidity around this issue with the Supreme Court expected to come down and rule on the presidential immunity question. So that's all to say that this is where public opinion stands right now, but as the situation on the ground changes, we can expect to see some of these numbers potentially move and the public react in different ways once the reality of a ruling, either from the Supreme Court on presidential immunity or from the New York State case, really come to fruition. So this is where we are right now, some good context settings to keep in mind, but just know that things might change as things start to develop and news changes as well. But what we know right now is that registered voters really don't distinguish between the different cases against Trump. Overall, most find them serious. But again, things may change as we get rulings the next few weeks. Now, as it relates to presidential immunity, we can see some partisan differences here and that come out in really expected ways, with Democrats and a majority of independents as well feeling that U.S. presidents shouldn't have immunity from being charged criminally over their conduct while in office. Of course, we do see Republicans falling on the other side of that issue. The one thing that most Americans agree on, regardless of partisanship as it relates to these Trump trials, is that the Supreme Court should decide the issue of presidential immunity quickly so that any ruling or dismissal of the cases surrounding Donald Trump can really be completed and decided before November. And that is something that's been consistent since we've been polling on this over the past year or so. Americans do want to see some rulings and movements on these issues ahead of November. Now on to our next topic, how Black Americans feel about the election. There's been a number of reports and coverage coming out over the past few weeks about Biden's weaknesses among this group and also Trump's marginal gains with Black Americans, which, Bernard will get into a little bit more in the next section. He has some really interesting analysis that'll dive into that issue with some more depth and with a finer tooth home. But to start us off, to just do some context setting here, I really want to spend some time looking at our Washington Post poll that we released over the past few weeks that is focused on Black Americans and how Black Americans are feeling about the country and the election. This is a really cool piece of research we've been running for the past couple of years. So right now, Black Americans do trust Biden over Trump on a wide range of issues, from racism, abortion, the economy. Black Americans are turning to Biden more so than Trump here. And we also see that this is not just an issue-based alliance with Biden. We are seeing Black Americans also just feel like the values and personality of Biden is also more acceptable than Trump in a lot of ways, with more Black Americans feeling that Biden cares about people like them, is honest and trustworthy. We do see some softer numbers on that mental sharpness point, which has been an undercurrent running through the campaign, running through Biden's, the criticism around Biden. So there is some wiggle there. There's some softness there relative to some other attributes. But overall, Black Americans do feel that Biden kind of comes out on top on a number of these more personality or value-based attributes. However, there is an enthusiasm gap among Black Americans when it comes to their certainty to vote that we really weren't seeing 4 years ago. And that's particularly true for younger Black Americans, those under the age of 65, and really those between the ages of 18 and 39. We are not seeing that movement, that enthusiasm gap in their certainty to vote for Black Americans over the age of 65. That's really kind of on par with what we saw 4 years ago. But again, this spells some worrying news for Biden, as Black Americans are a really key part of his base and his coalition should he want to win this election in November. And we can see on this slide perhaps why there is this enthusiasm gap. When we ask Black Americans, do you think President Biden's policies have helped or hurt Black people, we can see that a majority either feel that, these policies, Biden's presidency has made no difference, or in fact, 1 in 5 feel that these policies have actually hurt the Black community. So there is that top part of the slide is really talking about, really explaining kind of the enthusiasm gap. There isn't as much driving people to the polls because they're not feeling as seen, valued, or really helped by the Biden presidency. And on that bottom chart, we also asked Black Americans whether they feel that the Trump presidency helped, hurt, or made no difference for Black people. And I think this data really speaks to how when Trump was in office, there was a motivating factor for Black Americans. They felt that really a majority felt that Trump's policies hurt the Black community, and that kind of drove people to the polls. And with Trump out of office, not holding the White House, will there be as much of a pull to go out to vote come November? I think that's really an open question. And some of this data suggests that there is an enthusiasm gap right now for key parts of the Black community in Biden's base that, Bernard will get into in a really interesting detail later. So moving on to our media consumption and political beliefs. Now, we did release our first wave of election polling, which was very exciting over the past few weeks. We'll be following the same group of Americans over the past few months to see how their political behavior, attitudes, and opinions around the election really change over the course of the next few months. And one thing that really came out, a really powerful insight that pulled through in this research, was how important, how impactful media consumption, where people get their primary news, is in driving political beliefs and behaviors. So to just do some context setting here, to take a step back, we asked Americans where they get their news, and this is kind of where it falls out. We see that roughly 3 in 10 Americans get their news from mainstream sources. So that's CNN, MSNBC, network news, newspapers, national newspapers, which is roughly on par with the number of Americans who get their news from social media or really don't have a primary news source. So we see a wide range of opinions, really diverging and differing attitudes based on the information and political reality that are being framed by these primary news sources. And we do see some differences by race and education when we look at where people are going for their news. So I do want to draw your attention specifically to the social media and none dot and the mainstream media dot. That's really where kind of the difference in educational attainment comes into play. We do see that folks without a college degree tend to be more likely to get their news, source their news from social media, whereas folks with a college degree are more likely, or there's a predominance of mainstream media as their primary news source. And that is the thread that runs through the race and ethnicity cuts here. So very interesting, very important framing for, you know, who people are going to for their sources and the reality that's coming out to it that Bernard will get into in a second. Like I said, where people get their news really frames what they're worried about. So we can see that there's some outliers here. Fox News, conservative media, much more likely to say that immigration is a worry. That is a pretty big difference from the other sources of news people are turning to. And I think that really speaks to that main issue trend Chris was talking about, and how immigration, when it is centerfold, really kind of jumps up in importance for the main issue, but changes, of course, by different demographics. Now, for other news sources, we do see that the economy, inflation is a really key concern for most Americans across these different news sources. And again, the one exception tends to be the network news, newspaper, and those mainstream sources that cite political extremism as a main issue. And with that, I will kick it over to Bernard, who will walk us through how media consumption really goes on to frame that reality and political behavior I was talking about at the top. So with that, over to you, Bernard.
Totally, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit more about media consumption and a bit specifically on how you know, people's primary media source affects what they believe to be true or false. So to set up a bit of context for this section, we're going to talk a bit more about the election poll we've been talking about all this presentation, but we gave respondents a little pop quiz in our poll. Basically 5 true or false questions about immigration and 5 true or false questions about the 2020 election and election security. This was an example of one of our questions where, you know, a lot of Fox News, conservative media viewing Americans got this question incorrect, believing that the Biden administration opened the border to all undocumented immigrants. But on the next slide, you get the results to this little pop quiz. And basically what we find is that really a lot of Americans don't know what's going on. You know, only 15% really got a passing grade of 4 out of 5 or higher, you know, B or higher. But these levels of not knowing what's going on is particularly high among people who get the news from Fox News, conservative media, social media, or that little other / none category, which is kind of big. Whereas people who get their news from mainstream sources are a lot more likely to get more questions right when it comes to immigration. And this is particularly important on the next slide because people's understanding of what is true and false affects their understanding of, or their support or lack of support for various policies when it comes to immigration. So here, for example, people who get fewer questions right about immigration are a lot less likely to support a path to legal status for undocumented immigrants. Just as a quick note here, the discrepancy between people who answer 0 questions versus 1 out of 5 questions correctly, a lot of the people that answered 0 of the questions responded that they didn't know, which is why they align a lot closer to the American public as a whole. Whereas people who answered 1 out of the 5 questions tended to answer more of the questions incorrectly, which is why their support is a lot lower than all Americans as a whole. So on the next slide, this is an example from our other 5-question pop quiz on the 2020 election, where we see that levels of belief that Trump won the 2020 election is highest among Fox News, conservative media, viewing Americans. But again, when we go to the next slide and see the results of this quiz, we see the same pattern. Basically, most Americans don't really know exactly what's going on. Again, only 15% get a passing grade here of B or higher. And really the same pattern emerges where viewers of mainstream media tend to get more questions correct, whereas viewers of Fox News, conservative media, People who get their news from social media or that other / none category tend to answer a few of the questions incorrectly or don't really know what's going on or are misinformed of what's going on. And again, this impacts people's trust in elections. So here, similar to the other graphic we showed before, we see that people who answer fewer questions right about the election have much lower trust that the election will be open and fair compared to people who answer all the questions incorrectly. So this is just another example that people's media source affects their understanding of reality, whether they have a correct or uninformed perception of what's going on, and that ultimately affects people's support or lack of support for various policies and their trust for processes like the election. So on the next slide, we'll shift a bit more towards the election, and I'll dig a bit into what's changing between now and between 2020 and now. So for this slide, we compared our election survey, which we've been talking about, with the Pew 2020 post-election validated voter study. Basically, they polled a lot of Americans who they could validate actually voted in the 2020 election as a way to gauge, who was voting for who and track that over time. And so basically on this chart, the demographics that are more in the red have moved more towards Trump compared from 2020 to 2024, whereas demographics that are more blue have moved more towards Biden since 2020. And so what we really see is that most demographics, at least the ones pictured, are moving more towards Trump, particularly among Black, Hispanic, and younger Americans. Whereas few demographics, older Americans and some less educated Americans are moving more towards Biden. But really, we're seeing a lot of Biden hemorrhaging support among demographics he performed well at in 2020. And so on the next slide, when you break it down by race and education, the same pattern holds true. And I think this is just to note, I think Sarah talked a bit about this earlier from the Washington Post Ipsos study of Black Americans, but one reason why this may be happening isn't so much that Trump is doing better among Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, but more that Biden is doing worse and that there's an enthusiasm problem among Black Americans. But again, this is something we're going to be tracking over time. Election polls this far from election aren't as accurate as election polls getting closer to the election. So this is something we'll be tracking to see whether things shift. But again, signs that Biden just really has an enthusiasm problem, particularly among demographics he performed well at in 2020. And with that, I'll hand things back over to Chris, who's going to dig even deeper into the 2024 election. So without further ado, Chris.
Great, thank you, Bernard. Thank you, Sarah. So again, our new election poll came out 2 weeks ago. It's available on the Ipsos website. Encourage people to check it out. Lots of really interesting data in there. But a couple of observations from that I just wanted to jump into before going into this data is that media effect is true even controlling for partisanship, right? So even among Republicans who primarily get their news from conservative media versus not, those who get their news from other sources have different attitudes. And we see the same thing with Democrats, though not quite as extreme, the ones who are getting their news from MSNBC and CNN versus other sources. So there is, even within partisanship, an impact on that media source that I think is really interesting to understand. It probably isn't a one-way relationship, so it's just media informing. It's probably a bit of a feedback loop where certain people are attracted to a place like Fox News, which then reinforces their existing views of the world. But it is, I think, an important mechanism that is not as highly studied as some other topics are. Speaking of some of those other topics, what we have now in front of you is looking at some of our matchup data from a recent Reuters Ipsos poll on who is better on a number of issues. And it is, I think, pretty interesting to look at these data points because they indicate a couple of ongoing trends. One is that Donald Trump typically outperforms the Republican Party, the generic sort of Republican Party, which suggests that Trump's brand as an individual is stronger than the party's is. Meanwhile, Joe Biden also outperforms the Democratic Party a bit, but tends to not outperform as well, which suggests that Biden's brand is not necessarily as strong as the Democratic Party's is, at least in some sectors. So it is an interesting election context where the non-incumbent actually seems to have a stronger brand than the incumbent president, but the party out of power seems to not be as well liked as the party in power, which I think produces some really peculiar findings. Indeed, we saw in a recent New York Times Siena poll, Democratic Senate candidates in some swing states were outperforming Biden by 5 to 10 to even more than 10 percentage points. And I think that reflects a little bit of what we're seeing is Biden's sort of uniquely kind of weak position versus Trump, and generic Democrats' somewhat stronger position versus Republicans playing out. Next. But then looking specifically at some of the issues that we're following in our core political, this is the trend line from the start of the year across the major issues we're tracking. And it's basically just, is it more Biden or more Trump on each of these issues? You can see that there was a little bit of a bump in Biden's standing in March and April, essentially after the State of the Union. It's slid back down a little bit right now. But Biden is generally seen as stronger on political extremism and healthcare. Those are sort of the issues that he's a little bit stronger on versus Trump, who's seen as stronger on crime, foreign conflicts, the economy, and immigration. The ones that are sort of the top issues are in bold, so you can sort of see which ones are the most important. It still looks like Trump is stronger on 2 out of the 3 of the major issues, even though, again, it's becoming a little bit more of a two-way thing with the economy and political extremism as sort of the dominant 2 issues. But still, Trump's seen as having sort of a stronger grasp on both of those. But one thing I want to note, this chart sort of showing the matchup does sort of understate the fact that there is a substantial number of Americans who say neither of these guys is particularly good. We're talking about maybe 38% saying Trump and 32% saying Biden, which suggests there's another 30% saying neither of these guys, right? So it is an election that is characterized by a large chunk of Americans who are not terribly enamored of either of these candidates, many of whom are those low information voters, those people who are consuming no major media or social media only as their source of news, who actually may end up tipping the balance. Next slide. Which we actually go into here. This is our election poll by how they say they're going to vote in the full ballot among all people. So this allows for don't know, this allows for RFK, which isn't shown on the slide, etc. But the thing I really want to call your attention to is partisanship, of course, is really important. It has a major impact. You see Democrats are mostly supporting Biden, Republicans are mostly supporting Trump. Trump's actually doing slightly better among Republicans than Biden is among Democrats. That is part of the issue that Biden is struggling with that Sarah and Bernard have both just talked about. But you can see that news source actually has a major impact too. Indeed, Fox News is even more powerful as a predictor of Trump support than even being a Republican. And CNN and MSNBC watcher a little bit better than being a Democrat and predicting Biden support. But you can see that there is a bit of a range where people who primarily get their news from mainstream media, more likely to be Biden voters than Trump voters, people who are using sort of what we're calling fragmented media, which is this large group of smaller local news publications and online websites, a little bit more split, a little more sort of evenly matched between Biden and Trump. And I think honestly, if you were to be much more fine-grained and sort of take out like local newspapers versus sort of more sort of marginal online, you might see more of a pattern that looks like the mainstream media thing emerge. But again, these are a lot of places with relatively small circulation. But then you see among people who are primarily getting the news from social media or no major media source, that group actually leans more Trump than Biden by 2-to-1 to 3-to-1, depending on the news source, with, of course, the largest chunk of that group saying that they're not going to vote or they're going to vote third party. And that is a third of Americans. And that is where a lot of Trump's support is currently coming from, is from people that are essentially not really following any major news source or getting it from the news from social media. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind as we sort of look through the election, because if you're not getting news from any major news source, is advertising going to reach you? Is news about the campaign going to reach you? Are the debates going to reach you, right? Is there a lot of potential for anything that the campaigns do over the next 5 months to reach this third of Americans to sort of change their minds? I'm not sure. It's certainly something that we're going to watch, but it is something to keep in mind that a third of Americans are essentially not paying attention, and that third of Americans is contributing to Donald Trump's lead, or at least strong position in the polling right now versus Biden. Next slide, which we see here where we break down, actually, this is the pushed ballot. So among registered voters, if you're just a two-way race, how people vote, it's a tie in our poll, 48-48. But you can see about a quarter of Americans are mainstream media consumers and are voting for Biden. About 16% of Americans are social media, other non-consumers. They're voting for Trump. About 11% are conservative media voting for Trump. And you can see that the composition of the base for each of these candidates is pretty different, right? Where Biden reaches most of his base voters through mainstream media, through the networks, through newspapers, et cetera, with a little bit of digital, local, and social media added on. Whereas Trump, of course, is primarily through conservative media, but he actually has a large base that is in this social media other none category, which again, it's a question of how easy it is to reach those people, mobilize these people, inform those people. And I think it is going to be an open question how, if those people show up to vote, which is, I think, an open question, how much any of the campaign activities are going to change their minds. Next. So this is the ballot, actually, which I just referenced, just sort of showing you a little bit of the math of how it works. You can see among registered voters, Biden and Trump are essentially tied, with RFK getting about 5%, and then a little over 20%, almost a quarter saying other, wouldn't vote, don't know. Among that group of third party, other, wouldn't, don't know voters, if you just say, between these two, how are they going to vote? You can see they actually are a little bit more Trump leaning than Biden leaning, all told. Small margin, but you know, significant, with, again, about 1 in 8 who skip. So when you then combine those together into this combined ballot, this is sort of the pushed, you end up with essentially a tied race, 48-48. 1% who picked RFK in the first one and then skipped the second one. 1% who say other, 3% who say they don't know, would not vote, all told. So that's essentially what we're seeing, at least right now, is a lot of these people who are maybe not going to take part in the election, maybe they will. Whenever we get to reporting on likely voters in a couple of months, we typically do that around Labor Day in September. We might see them get filtered out, but at least at this moment in time, those marginal voters look like they're more Trump friendly than Biden friendly, contributing to Trump's strong performance in polling. So looking forward, the forecast is honestly pretty unchanged. We're still very much in a situation where the major sort of trends have been really static over the last couple of months. Honestly, it's a little surprising. I expected to see a little bit more movement next in our major trends. So what are we seeing? Well, the experts all basically in the same place, saying a toss-up. The only thing that changed is that race to White House model, which is primarily polling based, has gone from being slightly Biden to slightly Trump. That's a little bit of an artifact of which polls are included and what time. It's all basically still showing a toss-up, except for the CNN model, which still shows a Trump advantage. So the academics, the experts, the aggregators, all really showing the same thing that they did when we started reporting on these at the beginning of the year. So again, despite constant noise, constant tumult, seeming events happening all the time, no real fundamental change in what we're seeing in the election. Next. So looking a little deeper at the indicators that we use, again, not seeing a lot of difference or change in these. We're seeing that Biden continues to do a little bit better in the Midwest, that is Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Trump continues to do better relatively in the Southeast, that is Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, in the Southwest, Arizona, and Nevada. And at least at the moment, it looks like Trump is advantaged in those Sun Belt states, whereas Biden, maybe 50-50, maybe slightly better than 50-50 in the Midwest. But considering that Biden essentially needs to win the Democratic states plus the Midwest to win the Electoral College vote, that keeps us sort of in this coin flip territory. So again, basically unchanged from where we were last month. I think the one thing that's kind of interesting and is worth paying attention to is Biden has an advantage in fundraising, but that advantage seems to be declining. Trump has put in some really good fundraising numbers. He actually had a stronger April, I think it was April, maybe it's May, stronger recent month than Biden has in terms of overall fundraising, though Biden still has more cash on hand. So I think that's something that may actually start to shrink over the near term. Also, the main issue, we're still giving the main issue advantage on politics to Biden, but as you may have noticed in the earlier slide, he's actually only about 4 percentage points up on that versus Trump. So I think it is an open question of, is Biden actually still seen as stronger on protecting democracy and political extremism versus Trump? That one might actually end up being a bit of a push at the same time, which case economy is really sort of the sole issue that decides the election, which continues to be very Trump friendly. Though as Sarah was sharing with you, we are seeing inflation pressures subsiding a little bit. We're seeing those purchase comfort numbers coming up, but they're coming up real slowly, and that has to worry the White House. It has to worry the Biden campaign that's coming up too slowly to really help Biden standing with the public. So where are we? Well, we're still in this status quo place, right? Where the trends that we started the year with have basically stayed the same. We haven't seen any big shifts. Some of the historical patterns that we kind of expected to see, that is an incumbent president's approval rating, start to get better over the course of the election campaign cycle with a positive economy behind them, hasn't seemed to happen. Indeed, in our polling, we actually have Biden slightly lower now than at the start of the year. So, we continue to be in this sort of status quo position that advantages Trump. And I think we do have to continue to watch what's happening, particularly, of course, with the Trump trial verdict, which, we've never had something like that happen in American politics before. No idea how that kind of black swan event is going to affect things. Will definitely require us to sort of keep tracking this, but at least at this moment in time, we're still in the place where Trump looks to be slightly advantaged for the election. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. As always, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A option in the GoToWebinar application. Log your questions in. Sarah, Bernard, and I will answer as many as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we will send you an email with your response back. Also, all of this is public data. This is all data that we have published over the last month. It's available on the website, ipsos.com. We encourage you to go check it out. We're certainly happy to make the any of this available to you. So please do that. All right, let's see what questions we have. I see we have a couple already in. That's great. How much do you think voters' views on the economy are genuine versus emotional or feelings based? And how much do you think it might be a partisan projection? Sarah, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. I think that's hooking into a really important part of how economic public opinion frames attitudes around the election. To one extent, people's, whether it's a feeling, perception, what have you, people's feelings about the economy are just as real and just as important in their framing and ability to shape what happens in the election as the actual economic reality. I mean, people's reactions to that are just as real as CPI and consumer price index, etc. So, but I do think the question touches on a really important point, which is that, there are some partisan projections that do get filtered out onto the main issue, like we described with immigration and that falling as a main issue and the economy kind of taking up as a main issue and Republicans kind of focusing more in on the economy as a result. So there are some of those partisan projections at play in the main issue and what is important. But I think, people's feelings about the economy are just as real and really actually more important in understanding how people are feeling about the election than the actual economic reality on the ground to some extent.
Yeah, and absolutely kind of made up rule of thumb is it's about a third like your sort of political view of the world, about 2/3 reality, like actual economic reality. So that is, again, a very much an impression from watching what we see happen in our consumer confidence data over the years. What is the percent overlap between people saying the economy in the first slide and inflation in the second slide? So those are from two separate surveys, so we can't exactly correlate them, but we can say that they do have a really high degree of correlation. And typically what that economy number means in our main issue tracker is really inflation and costs. That's really how people are sort of using it. And unfortunately, one of the challenges of long-term research like what we do in our core political is there's only so much editing that we can do to the way the question is asked without breaking the trend line. So we try not to do that as much as we can. And that's why we actually ask the question in different ways in different surveys, because any one question probably does not give you a perfect view of reality, but across a number of surveys, you can start to triangulate in on what we think is happening. And inflation is clearly still a major issue. It's still something people are very upset about, they still concerned about. And yes, I do think that for a lot of Americans, when they tell us it's the economy, what they're really telling us is it's inflation and the cost of things. Sarah Bernard, I'll let one of you grab this next question. In terms of the partisan response to the true false news item quiz, how much do we think the answers reflect an ignorance versus a projection of what they want to be true?
Interesting question. Bernard, I saw you make a move. I can take it. I'll jump in. I think that projection and that question about political projection is a really interesting one. I'm not sure we can really tease out what people's intentions are when answering the question exactly, but what we can say from the data is that your news source and your partisanship does go on to frame, what you think is true, how your ability to answer these questions. What we can tell from other polling is that particularly on that, Donald Trump won the 2020 election item, we do see Republicans over the course, a good chunk of Republicans over the course of a number of different polls over time answering that as true. So that is a consistency that I think adds some weight into how people are viewing the world through that lens. But yeah, the ability to tease out what is true or false. I mean, the way we do ask the question is like, evaluate this as true or false. So we do kind of expect people to do that in that way. But of course, there's always nuance with how people actually end up approaching that. I don't know, Chris, Bernard, if you have anything.
There's a long-running debate in social science research about the suitability of surveys to measure facts. And some people believe that a lot of it's motivated reasoning, and that like if you were to ask somebody, did Trump win the election? And then it's like, do you think Trump really won the election? Like you'd get different answers. And indeed, there's been some research shown where like when you ask people some of these knowledge questions, you get one answer, but then if you ask them a knowledge question, say, if you give us the correct answer, you'll get $5, you'll get something that's a little bit more accurate to the truth, suggesting that there is some motivated reasoning happening. I don't know if we can necessarily say which one's happening in the survey, but as Sarah said, it is important that no matter what the rationale that causes people to arrive at these viewpoints, it does seem to have a very clear impact on their views of the world and their vote preferences. And as Bernard was showing, people who had a better command of those facts, whether projection or not, were more likely to support a pathway to citizenship, or more likely to have confidence that the election will be free and secure. So maybe it's motivated reasoning, maybe it's a literal not understanding the facts, but either way, it matters. It has an impact on people's views of the world. In your last presentation, threats to democracy ranked #1, and in this one, it's neck and neck with the economy. How do the candidates stack up on threats to democracy? We had a slide on that. We actually showed that Biden is slightly ahead of Trump on the threats to democracy item, but it's not terribly far out. You'd think that the Biden camp would want to see a bigger advantage on that number versus Donald Trump. But yeah, it is. I think it has become something of a two-issue race at this point, with the economy favoring Trump, helping him with sort of those unengaged voters who I think are really sort of responding a lot into price pressures, and then democracy sort of really animating a lot of the Biden base, and maybe helping him with some more engaged voters. But I think that sort of like the never Trumper Republicans, for instance. But I think that's a relatively small population relative to that much larger sort of unengaged group that Trump's able to take advantage of. Has abortion and post-Dobbs women's health passion faded? The issue seems to have fallen down the table of priorities. Sarah, Bernard, do you want to take this? Sarah had written an op-ed on this not that long ago.
Yeah. The abortion as it relates to an election, as an electoral issue, is a really interesting question. We do see abortion kind of lower down on the list of priorities. We see, when we ask people how they intend to vote, what issues are motivating them, we do see that change a little bit when we look at specific sub-demographics. So I think, presidential elections are decided by a few thousand people typically in key states. And so more marginal issues relative to the national scheme of things can have an impact. And I think abortion is a really powerful example of that. So, certainly you're not going to see it on the top 3 issues on the national level, but it has been and can be impactful in these elections because it is a motivating issue for subsegments of the population. And we do see that in polling today as well.
And I think one of the things we found as we've been sort of, if you've been with us for several months in these, we've been asking about the main issue and we've been sort of experimenting with this political extremism, threats to democracy question that we did add to that item, is that abortion actually folds into that for a lot of folks, where abortion is a major issue, but they actually see the overturning of Roe, the Dobbs decision, sort of the things happening in the states, as part of a larger sort of assault on democracy or actions of an extremist group. So abortion actually becomes a good example of that, but it isn't actually the issue in and of itself. Instead, it's part of this larger sort of attack on sort of people's view of modernity. So I think abortion is still as Sarah was saying, a powerful issue, but I think the way we're sort of capturing it or measuring it is actually inside that political extremism item. Let's see, any other questions? No, I think that's all we have. So like I said, this is all public data. It's available on our website. This presentation we'll be posting on our website in the next couple of days, along with a recording of the webinar. We've also started producing sort of a short written digest version of this as well that we'll be distributing, that you could share with colleagues or clients or whomever you might want. That's a much more sort of quick 15-minute sort of take on sort of the key issues that we see. Our next Inside Track is scheduled for June 25th. So please write that down. Please don't hesitate to join us then. We will presumably have the Trump trial verdict, and we'll have had some time to see if that actually has made an impact on the election. It'll be well into summer. It'll be 4 months out from the election, so we'll see if the Biden campaign is actually getting any traction. We'll also see if inflation continues to come down and makes maybe Biden's standing with the public start to improve, though that hasn't seemed to happen yet. So lots of things to keep track of, to keep in tune. So please join us then. But until then, I'm Chris Jackson, Sarah Feldman, Bernard Mendez. We appreciate you joining us and have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.